That morning, the rescue center fell silent in a way that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. Milo, the baby elephant who usually ran to greet his keepers at sunrise, stood frozen in front of a cold, concrete wall, refusing food, water, and even the sound of his own name, as if someone on the other side was still worth waiting for. The veterinarians searched his body and found no illness, but a strip of red cloth and a haunting stretch of nighttime footage began to uncover a truth no one was ready for. Whatever was destroying Milo was not in his blood, his heart, or his lungs. It was a grief too large for a baby elephant to understand. And when his keepers finally learned what had broken that little heart, they realized they were no longer trying to save a failing body. They were trying to bring a wounded soul back from the darkest kind of waiting. The first light over Blue Ridge Elephant Rescue Center came softly, sliding through the mist that clung to the North Carolina hills. In the gray-blue hush before visitors, the barns usually woke in layers: metal latches, low animal calls, boots on damp gravel. But that morning, one sound was missing, and the silence around Milo's yard felt deeply wrong. Milo was usually the pulse of the place. At barely 18 months old, he greeted sunrise like it belonged to him, splashing the water trough, kicking dust over his back, and racing to the fence the second he heard breakfast carts rattle. The keepers joked that he could recognize Ethan Cole's footsteps before any human voice, and most mornings they were right. He loved routines the way young elephants love certainty. Sarah Collins would lean against the gate with apple slices in her pocket, pretending to hide them while Milo searched her jacket with his clever little trunk. He would bump her hip, flap his oversized ears, then trumpet so loudly that the macaws in the education wing answered back from across the trees. So when Ethan crossed the service, rode and found Milo's enclosure still, his own stride slowed without thinking. The hay net hung full. The shallow pool lay smooth and untouched, reflecting a pale strip of sky. Even the gulls that sometimes landed near the feed bins seemed to keep their distance, as if the quiet inside that fence had a shape they could feel. At first, Ethan thought Milo might be sleeping in the far shade. Then he saw him. The calf stood in the back corner near the concrete wall behind the recovery barn, his narrow body angled toward it as though listening. He wasn't lying down, wasn't pacing, wasn't reaching for food. He was simply standing there, perfectly still, with his trunk resting against the ground. Ethan called his name in the bright, easy tone Milo always answered. Nothing. He tried again, softer this time, and let the gate click open. Usually that tiny sound alone would send Milo trotting over in excitement. Today the calf did not turn. One ear twitched once, then went still. The distance between them was not far, but it suddenly felt enormous. Sarah arrived moments later carrying the breakfast pail, already smiling before she saw Ethan's face. The smile vanished almost at once. Together, they watched Milo from the gate, both waiting for some sign that would break the spell. A curious glance, a breathy huff, even a stubborn refusal. Instead, he kept staring toward the wall, as if the world behind him had ceased to matter. Sarah set the pail down and crouched, speaking to him the way she had since he first came to Blue Ridge. Low, patient, warm. She slid an apple slice across the dirt, then another. Milo didn't move. The sweet smell drifted toward him and stayed there. For the first time since she had known him, he looked like a baby too tired to want comfort, and it chilled her. When Ethan finally stepped closer, The change in Milo hit him harder than the silence had. The calf's bright, restless eyes were half-lidded now, their shine dulled to something distant. His shoulders seemed drawn inward. The playful tension in his trunk was gone. Ethan laid a hand against Milo's side and felt warmth, life, and a strange emptiness that made his own chest tighten. Dr. Claire Bennett was called before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. While staff moved quietly around the yard, Milo remained where he was, facing the same wall as if it held an answer no one else could see. Claire watched him for a long moment before opening her case. Behind her, the rescue center kept breathing, but around the calf, time seemed to narrow and stall. The first exam brought no obvious explanation. His skin was warm, but not fevered. His breathing stayed steady. No swelling marked his legs, no wound hid behind his ears, no sign of a nighttime accident disturbed the dirt around him. Yet the untouched food, the still water, and the vacancy in his posture said more than any chart could. Something inside him had stepped back. By late morning, the staff who loved Milo had gathered in quiet fragments beyond the fence. Ben from facilities stood with his radio forgotten in one hand. Tessa Morgan, new to the enrichment team, whispered that she had never seen a young elephant hold himself so rigid for so long. No one argued. Milo had become the center of a silence that pulled every eye toward him. Then a sharp, metallic bang sounded from somewhere behind the recovery barn. It was small, just a door catching wrong in the wind. But Milo reacted at last. His trunk lifted an inch from the dirt. His ears gave a faint tremor. For one suspended second, hope rushed through the yard so quickly it almost hurt. But he did not turn around. He only listened, then fell still again. As the afternoon light thinned across the wall, Sarah stayed near the fence and kept talking to him about nothing at all. Rain coming tomorrow, apples in the feed room, the mud pond he loved on hot days. Milo stood motionless through every word. Yet before Ethan walked away to make the next call, he noticed one thing. The calf was no longer facing the world. He was waiting beyond it. By noon, the mountain light had turned thin and white, washing the yard in a brightness that only made Milo's stillness look stranger. He had not touched the hay, had not reached for fruit, had not lowered his head to drink. From a distance, he could have been mistaken for calm, but up close, there was nothing restful in the way he held himself. Dr. Claire Bennett began with the ordinary things, because ordinary things were what saved animals most often. She checked his temperature, listened to his chest, studied the slow blink of his eyes, and pressed careful fingers along his jaw and trunk. Milo endured it all without protest. That frightened her more than resistance would have. A young elephant should have pushed back, shifted his weight, swung his trunk, complained in some small, offended way. Milo did none of it. He stood as if his body were present only out of habit, while some deeper part of him remained fixed on the unseen space beyond the wall. Even when Claire lifted his ear and shined a light inside, he barely reacted. Sarah tried again with the foods that usually broke through any mood. Sweet potato mash, warm oat pellets soaked soft, bits of banana hidden beneath melon, the kind of trick that had fooled Milo before. The smell drifted through the yard and settled in the cool air. Milo gave one faint breath through his trunk, then returned to the same heavy silence. Claire drew blood while Ethan stood at Milo's shoulder, one hand braced lightly against the calf's side. The sample looked normal at first glance. No strange color, no sign of obvious distress, and that only deepened the unease moving through the staff. A sick animal gave clues. Milo gave almost none. He was fading in a way charts did not know how to measure. By early afternoon, the rescue center had changed around him. Conversations lowered when people neared the elephant yard. Tools were carried more quietly. Even the interns who had only known Milo a few weeks seemed to move with a kind of instinctive reverence, as if noise itself might harm him. In the middle of it all, Milo stayed facing the wall, patient and unreachable. When Ethan asked for the first lab readout, Claire took longer than usual to answer. The numbers were steady. No infection markers. No clear dehydration crisis yet, though she could see it coming if he kept refusing water. No sign of intestinal blockage. No toxic spike. She hated the calmness of those results. They felt less like reassurance than betrayal. Word reached the administrative office before the sun began to dip. A conference call was scheduled. Policy, liability, emergency thresholds, transfer options. Ethan listened with his jaw set, while people who had never watched Milo chase butterflies spoke about timelines and intervention windows. The calf, meanwhile, stood 10 yards away, trying not to move, as if movement itself would mean giving something up. The board's decision came in the language institutions preferred: measured, reasonable, almost kind. If Milo refused both food and water through the next 48 hours, they would authorize a deeper medical intervention. IV fluids, sedation if necessary, a transport team from Florida on standby. Ethan understood the logic. He still felt, without proof, that they were approaching the wrong wound. Later, when the yard was quieter again, Sarah stepped closer with a bucket of water and dipped her hand into it, splashing the surface the way Milo liked to do on warm mornings. For one trembling second, he turned his eye toward the sound, not toward her, not toward the water, but only enough to show that something inside him still heard the world. Then the eye drifted away. That brief movement traveled through the staff, like hope and heartbreak at once. Ben, standing by the service gate, muttered that maybe the calf was coming back. But Tessa, watching from farther off, said softly that it didn't look like Milo was choosing between them and the wall. It looked like he was listening for something from the other side and losing strength every time it didn't come. As evening crept over the hills, Claire requested one more quiet exam before dark. She checked his gums, watched the rise and fall of his ribs, and kept noticing the same terrible contradiction. Milo's body still held together. His heart still beat cleanly. His lungs still worked. Nothing in him seemed ready to fail, and yet the will to reach for life was slipping farther from reach. Ethan remained after the others stepped back, the chill of dusk settling into his jacket. Milo had not eaten. He had not drunk. But once, when the wind pushed a hollow sound from behind the recovery barn, the calf's ears trembled again. Claire saw it too. She closed her kit and looked at Ethan with a tired, troubled certainty. "This may not be in his body," she said. "It may be somewhere deeper." Morning returned to Blue Ridge with a pale, washed-out light, the kind that made every fence post and water trough look colder than it had the day before. Milo was still in the same corner when Ethan arrived, still facing the wall behind the recovery barn. Overnight, dew had gathered on his back, and he had not even shaken it off. The calf's food from yesterday had been cleared away and replaced with fresh hay, sliced pears, and warm grain mash. None of it mattered. Milo did not turn at the sound of buckets or at Sarah's voice, or even at the squeak of the feed cart wheels he had once chased with ridiculous joy. His silence had stopped feeling temporary. It was beginning to feel chosen. Yet there was something inside that still seemed awake. Tessa Morgan, the newest member of the enrichment team, noticed it first because she was not yet trained to stop looking once a medical answer failed to appear. She took a folding stool out past the gate and sat in the cold for nearly an hour, watching Milo the way birdwatchers watched a distant tree line. At first, she thought he was simply fixed on the concrete. Then, the pattern revealed itself. Every few minutes, when wind slipped around the back of the recovery barn or a latch clicked somewhere beyond it, Milo's ears made the smallest movement. Not enough for most people to catch. Just a faint tremor, as if some part of him were still listening through a door no one else could see. Twice, a maintenance cart rolled past the far service path. Twice, Milo's trunk lifted barely an inch from the dirt before falling again. He never turned toward the sound in front of him. He never searched the yard. All his waiting seemed directed through that one stretch of wall. Tessa wrote nothing down at first. The observation felt too intimate, almost like overhearing grief. When Ethan came by to check on the morning team, she asked him to stand still and say nothing. They waited together in the chill, looking not at Milo's whole body now, but at his ears, the line of his jaw, the exhausted angle of his trunk. A moment later, a metal gate clanged softly behind the barn. Milo's right ear flicked once. Ethan's face tightened. He did not want to build hope around a single twitch, but it was more than they had yesterday. Sarah joined them, and then Claire, each arriving with the same guarded hunger for meaning. No one spoke above a whisper. They watched the calf, as if afraid clarity might vanish if approached too fast. Milo stayed still, but no longer seemed absent. He seemed fixed on an unseen threshold. Later that afternoon, Tessa asked for permission to enter the yard alone, without medical tools, without food, without any expectation except to observe. Ethan agreed, though Sarah hesitated. Milo had never frightened anyone, but sorrow made every creature harder to read. Tessa moved slowly across the dirt, angling wide so she would not crowd him, and that was when she saw it near his feet. A strip of cloth lay half hidden in the mud, no longer than a hand, darkened by dirt, but still unmistakably red beneath the stain. Milo's trunk shifted over it at once, not snatching, not panicking, just covering it with a possessiveness so gentle it broke Tessa's heart. He touched the fabric once, then pressed the tip of his trunk lightly against the wall again, as if the two belonged together. By then, the yard had gone so quiet that even Ben Walker, hurrying over from facilities with his radio clipped to his belt, slowed before reaching the gate. Tessa described what she had seen. Sarah swore she had never brought anything like that into the enclosure. Claire frowned, trying to place the color, the texture, the size. Ethan said nothing at all. His eyes remained on the cloth. Milo lowered his head then, not to eat, not to drink, but to gather the red strip more securely beneath his trunk. It was such a careful movement, almost tender, and it changed the feeling in the yard. This was no random object chewed up in play. He was guarding it, keeping it close, waiting beside a wall and holding a piece of something that had become more important than food. Tessa finally said what the others were beginning to feel. "He isn't staring at the wall," she murmured. "He's listening through it." No one corrected her. Behind the recovery barn, a distant door opened and shut. Milo's ears trembled again, and for one aching second, his body leaned forward, the way a child might lean toward footsteps in a hallway, hoping they belonged to someone familiar. That evening, Ethan ordered a full review of recent movement logs around the barn and asked Ben to pull overnight surveillance from the last week. Sarah stayed near the fence until dusk, watching Milo hold that strip of red cloth like a relic no one had meant him to keep. In the fading light, the wall behind him no longer looked like concrete. It looked like the edge of a memory. That night, a cold rain moved over the Blue Ridge Hills and tapped softly against the roofs of the rescue center. Most of the staff had gone home, but the lights in the operations office stayed on. Milo remained in the back corner of his yard, barely visible on the monitor feeds, still turned toward the same wall, the red strip tucked beneath his trunk like something precious. Ben Walker sat before a row of surveillance screens with a legal pad on his knee and a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He handled cameras, gates, storm backups, and power logs, the quiet machinery that kept Blue Ridge running. Until now, he had never imagined that one of those black and white night feeds might hold the answer to a grieving elephant's silence. Ethan stood behind him with his arms crossed, while Claire leaned against the file cabinet, reading every flicker on the screen as if she could diagnose sorrow by frame rate alone. Sarah had refused to leave and sat near the door in her mud-stained boots, hands wrapped around a paper cup she never drank from. No one spoke much. The room had taken on the hush of a chapel. Ben started with the previous night. The infrared footage showed Milo exactly as they had found him, motionless near the wall, his small body washed silver in the camera's glow. Hours passed in silence. Then, a little after 1 in the morning, Milo lifted his trunk, reached down, and carefully pulled the red strip closer, pressing it against the center of his chest before leaning back toward the concrete. No one in the room moved. The gesture was so deliberate, so intimate, that it felt wrong to witness it without permission. Milo was not playing. He was not restless. He was holding on. Sarah let out a breath that shook on the way up, and Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, as if embarrassed by the depth of pain a single movement could reveal. Ben rewound and widened the view. For long stretches, Milo never lay down. He shifted his weight once, then once again, but always returned to the same place, the same angle, the same quiet waiting. Near dawn, he pressed the tip of his trunk flat against one section of wall and stayed that way so long that Claire finally whispered, "He's listening for something that isn't coming." They went back another night, then another. The pattern held. Milo did not wander the enclosure. He did not test the fence, reach for branches, or search the trough. He stood his lonely vigil at the wall, sleeping only in fragments, never more than minutes at a time. Each time a sound echoed from behind the recovery barn, his ears trembled, and the ache in the office deepened. Then Ben pulled footage from 6 nights earlier, the night the storm had rolled down from Tennessee with sudden violence. The timestamp flickered from a brief power fluctuation. Rain slashed across the lens in silver sheets. Emergency lights blinked red along the service road. Through the distortion, staff figures moved quickly between buildings, heads lowered, jackets whipped by wind. A service cart appeared near the recovery barn, half hidden by the rain. 2 handlers hurried beside it, and behind them came a shape larger than the others, covered almost completely by a heavy blanket. The image blurred when lightning flashed, then steadied just long enough to show movement toward the rear entrance of the barn, the same structure that shared a wall with Milo's enclosure. Ben froze the frame, but the storm had smeared the details into shadows and light. It was impossible to make out faces, impossible to see what had been carried inside. Still, the room changed at once. Ethan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth. Claire looked not at the figures anymore, but at the timestamp, as though the date itself had suddenly turned dangerous. Ben checked the maintenance log and found what the cameras had not shown clearly. A power dip. Rear barn access opened under emergency override. Recovery suite. Sealed for a veterinary event at 11:42 p.m. The line below that was incomplete, cut off mid-entry, as if whoever had written it had been called away before finishing. Ethan took the clipboard from Ben without saying a word. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything the rain had brought. They all knew the recovery barn was used for critical cases, for transfusions, overnight monitoring, and the kind of emergencies staff did not discuss in hallways. Milo had not been inside it. Yet something on the other side of that wall had happened during the storm, and now the calf was waiting, like his whole heart had been left there. Before anyone could speak, Ben rolled the footage forward a few minutes. Another lightning flash lit Milo's yard. Through the grainy image, the calf could be seen near the far fence, smaller than he looked now, restless and circling. Then, abruptly, the screen jumped. When the feed stabilized, Milo was no longer pacing. He was standing at the wall for the first time, as if the night had split him in two. Ethan asked for every movement log, treatment report, and overnight record from that storm. Claire wanted the veterinary sheets from recovery. Sarah only stared at Milo's frozen image on the monitor, that tiny body standing in the rain while the world moved around him. Outside, the real storm had passed, but in the office, it felt as if they were only now hearing the first low crack of thunder. By dawn, the rain had thinned to a cold mist, but no one at Blue Ridge felt any sense of relief. Ethan carried the storm logs under one arm and headed straight for records before the morning rounds began. Milo was still at the wall when he passed the yard, still guarding the strip of red cloth, as if the night had confirmed what his heart already knew. The rescue center kept its paperwork in layers, medical charts in one office, transport sheets in another, emergency barn access in a locked cabinet near operations. On ordinary days, that system worked. In a crisis, it scattered the truth into pieces. Ethan sat beneath a humming fluorescent light and began pulling files from 6 nights earlier, the night everything had changed. Claire joined him with treatment summaries from the recovery suite. Ben brought the override printouts. Sarah arrived last, still wearing the same jacket from the previous evening, carrying nothing but a look Ethan had seen on people before hard news. For a while, all they heard was paper turning, drawers opening, and the quiet, stubborn sound of people refusing to stop until the story made sense. The first clear answer came from a clipped incident report signed just before midnight. A mature female elephant had collapsed in the east paddock during the storm after showing signs of acute cardiac distress. She had been moved under emergency protocol to Recovery Barn 2. The patient's name sat in the center of the page like a blow no one had braced for. Grace. Sarah lowered herself into the nearest chair as if her knees had forgotten how to hold her. Grace had been Milo's whole sky since the calf arrived. She was steady where he was impulsive, patient where he was needy, always touching him in small ways that seemed almost invisible until one imagined the space without them. Ethan read the report again, hoping the letters would rearrange into something kinder. Claire found the next piece in the sedation log. During Grace's transfer, the calf had become highly agitated, circling, vocalizing, and pressing dangerously close to the service gate in the wind and confusion. To prevent injury to both animals and staff, Milo had been given a mild sedative through a dart from the side lane. The note was clinical. The reality felt brutal. He had been asleep. That knowledge moved through the room more heavily than the death itself. While Grace was carried through the back doors of the recovery barn, while thunder broke over the ridge and red emergency lights flashed across wet concrete, Milo had been slipping under, his body going still before his mind could understand that his mother was being taken away. Linda Shaw, the laundry and recovery supervisor, was called from the barn to help fill in what the reports did not say. She stood in the doorway with both hands clasped tight, her face already pale from the questions in Ethan's voice. Yes, Grace had been covered with a red thermal blanket to keep her warm. Yes, she had died before sunrise. No, Milo had never seen her again. For several seconds, no one spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead. Outside, a cart rolled over gravel, ordinary and far away. Then Linda remembered something else. When the barn had been cleaned after the emergency, one of the red blankets could not be found. They had assumed it had gone out with the storm laundry or been misplaced in the rush. No one had thought to keep looking. Ethan closed his eyes only after the picture was complete enough to hurt in full. Milo had woken in his own yard to a world that no longer contained Grace. On the other side of the wall, her scent had lingered in blankets, straw, medicine, and rain. Somewhere in the confusion, the calf had found or been given a torn piece of the last thing that had held her warmth, and he had never let it go. Naomi Green had not arrived yet, but the room no longer needed an expert to name what they were staring at. Milo was not refusing breakfast. He was not resisting treatment. He was waiting at the last place his mother had existed. Every hour he had spent facing the concrete had been a kind of vigil. Every untouched meal a sign that the world had ended, and only he had not been told. Sarah covered her mouth and began to cry without sound. Claire turned away toward the window, one hand pressed hard against the glass. Ben, who spent most days solving problems with hinges and cameras and storm batteries, looked suddenly helpless in a way Ethan would remember for years. None of them had meant to abandon Milo inside that loss. That did not make the abandonment less real. When Ethan finally stepped back into the yard, Milo was still standing in the same corner, the red strip tucked carefully beneath his trunk. Morning light rested across the wall in a pale band, and the calf's shadow fell small and thin against the dirt. Ethan stopped a few feet away and understood, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that Milo had not been staring at concrete. He had been waiting for his mother to come home. He did not touch the calf at first. He only stood beside him in the quiet and looked at the wall that had held so much pain without ever speaking. Then, very softly, Ethan said Grace's name out loud for the first time in Milo's hearing. The calf did not turn, but his ears gave the faintest tremor. It was not healing. It was not peace, but it was the beginning of the truth. The next morning arrived without drama, only a low silver fog hanging over the trees, and the smell of wet straw drifting across the yard. Milo was still in the corner when Sarah came in, still holding close to the wall that had become his last doorway to grace. But something had changed. He no longer looked only lost. He looked tired from carrying the same moment too long. Dr. Naomi Green reached Blue Ridge just after sunrise, stepping out of a dusty SUV with a canvas field bag and the calm gaze of someone who had spent years studying sorrow in animals no one believed could grieve so deeply. She did not hurry into the yard. She stood at the fence first, letting Milo feel her presence without pressure, as if grief itself required an introduction. No one had to explain much once she saw him. The angle of his body, the fixed attention toward the wall, the red strip protected beneath his trunk, the refusal to eat in the absence of any real illness. It all gathered into something Naomi recognized at once. She said it quietly, not as a theory, but as a truth no one could avoid now. Milo was in grief shut down. She explained that elephants did not move through loss the way humans wish they would. They searched. They waited. They returned to scents, objects, spaces, and sounds linked to the one who was gone. Deprived of understanding, they could remain suspended there, neither fully living nor fully letting go. Milo was not being stubborn. He was trapped inside a question his body could not answer. Ethan listened with both hands braced on the fence rail, his knuckles pale against the wood. Naomi told him that forced treatment might keep Milo's body alive for a while, but it would not reach the place where the damage had begun. What the calf needed first was not correction. It was acknowledgement. The loss had to be made visible. The bond had to be honored in front of him. So they built a plan no emergency handbook had ever taught them. Sarah brought one of the clearest photos of Grace from the archives, an image taken in late summer when Milo had still been small enough to fit beneath the curve of her neck. Ben found a stand strong enough to hold it at Milo's eye level. Linda brought the washed red blanket and folded it carefully nearby. Claire asked for Grace's bell, the one she used to wear on slow, supervised walks between the east paddock and the indoor barn. Its tone was soft and low, nothing like the sharp sounds of gates or tools. They placed it beside the blanket, along with a bundle of fresh straw from Grace's old stall, and one smooth branch she had liked to lean against while Milo played in the dirt at her feet. When everything was ready, they opened the side section of the yard and made space without crowding him. Naomi insisted on quiet. No coaxing, no excitement, no hands pulling at hope too soon. Sarah sat a few yards away with a book in her lap, reading in a low, even voice, not because Milo understood words, but because rhythm could sometimes guide a frightened heart where logic could not. At first, nothing happened. Milo remained where he was, body turned toward the wall, trunk resting over the strip of blanket, as though any movement might cause the last trace of Grace to disappear. Wind moved lightly through the trees. Somewhere behind the barn, a latch clicked and settled. The whole rescue center seemed to hold its breath around a baby elephant standing inside a private storm. Then Ethan did something none of them had expected from him. He stepped into the yard alone and stopped a careful distance from Milo, not trying to touch him, not trying to lead him anywhere. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. He told the calf he was sorry. Sorry they had let him wake up confused. Sorry they had not shown him the truth. Sorry they had left him waiting. Milo did not turn right away, but the silence around him changed. One ear gave a slow, unsteady flick. His trunk tightened over the red cloth, then loosened. Naomi said nothing. Sarah kept reading in that same quiet cadence, the kind a mother might use at the end of a long day. For several aching moments, the calf remained still, balanced on the edge between memory and motion. Then, with a hesitation so small it almost broke the heart to witness, Milo shifted his weight. One forefoot moved, then the other. The steps were shallow and unsure, more like remembering than walking, but they carried him away from the wall for the first time since Grace had died. He stopped in front of the photograph and lifted his trunk toward the image of his mother's face. No one cried out. No one rushed forward. Milo touched the frame with the gentlest brush of his trunk, then lowered it to the folded blanket below. Sarah slid a piece of pear across the dirt and waited. After a long moment, Milo picked it up, held it, and instead of eating, placed it carefully at the foot of Grace's picture. By evening, he still had not healed, but he was no longer standing only inside the dark. For several days after Milo touched Grace's photograph, the rescue center moved around him with a new kind of patience. He still spent long stretches near the corner, and he still carried the red strip of blanket as if it belonged to the shape of his body now. But he had begun to drink a little, and once each morning, he walked the short path to the photo and stood there in silence. Sarah never called it progress out loud. She knew better than to pin hope to a schedule. Some afternoons, Milo would take a pear slice gently from her hand, hold it for a while, then set it down by Grace's picture before eating anything else. Other times, he ignored the food completely and drifted back toward the wall, as if grief were a tide that pulled hardest when no one could see it. Naomi stayed at Blue Ridge longer than planned, observing him from a respectful distance and making notes in a weathered leather journal. She told Ethan that healing rarely moved in a straight line, especially in young elephants whose worlds had once been held together by one steady presence. Milo was not simply learning to eat again. He was learning how to wake up in a world that no longer made sense. Then, just as the staff had begun to settle into that fragile rhythm, a call came from southern Louisiana. A private roadside animal attraction had flooded after days of relentless rain, and emergency crews were evacuating everything they could reach. In the chaos, a young female elephant had been pulled from a partially collapsed holding pen. Her mother had not survived the storm surge. The calf's name was Ruby. She was smaller than Milo, younger by a few months, and according to the transport team, nearly frantic whenever left alone for more than a minute. She cried through loading, cried through the highway transfer, and cried again when the truck stopped for fuel. By the time Ethan hung up the phone, he already knew what Naomi was going to say before she opened her mouth. He refused at first. Milo was still too delicate, too newly returned from the edge of disappearance. Another orphaned calf might bring stress, noise, confusion, or worse, stir open the wound they had only just begun to name. But Naomi did not argue in the usual way. She only said that sorrow sometimes answered sorrow more honestly than comfort ever could, and then she let the silence do the rest. Ruby arrived on a gray afternoon under a sky heavy with more rain. The transport trailer backed slowly toward the quarantine lane, while staff kept the path clear and voices low. Through the slats, they could hear her before they saw her. A broken, searching sound, high and raw, not loud enough to be dramatic, but desperate enough to unmake something in the chest of anyone listening. Milo was in the outer yard when the truck rolled in. At first, he gave no sign he had noticed. He stood near Grace's picture, trunk hanging still, eyes half-lidded in that distant way the staff had come to fear. But when Ruby cried again from inside the trailer, one of his ears moved. It was small, easy to miss if no one had been watching for miracles disguised as reflex. They settled Ruby in the enclosure beside Milo's, separated by a high mesh barrier and a strip of open ground. It was the safest arrangement, close enough to see and smell, far enough to protect them both if fear took over. Ruby did not care about caution. She paced the fence line, turning in quick, anxious circles, reaching her trunk through the mesh toward every shadow that moved. Milo kept his distance. He did not approach the fence. He did not answer her cries. Once, near sunset, he walked a few steps in that direction, then stopped and turned back toward Grace's photograph instead. Sarah watched the moment with a sinking heart. Ruby called into the deepening evening, and Milo stood between two worlds, unable to leave one and not yet able to enter the other. Night settled damp and cold over the hills. Ruby refused her food, then shoved at the gate with more force than anyone expected from such a small body. Ben reinforced the side latch while Claire monitored from the service lane, and Naomi told everyone to stay calm. Fear, she said, often sounded like anger in young animals. Still, the distress in Ruby's cries spread across the rescue center like smoke. Near midnight, thunder rolled low over the mountains. It was not yet a storm, only the warning of one building beyond the ridge. But the sound changed Ruby at once. She froze, lifted her head, and let out a long, aching call that was unmistakable in any language. A child's call for a mother who was not coming. Sarah, standing in the dark beyond the gate, felt tears sting before she knew why. Milo had been standing near the old corner when Ruby cried out again, softer this time, almost hoarse with exhaustion. For a moment, nothing changed. Then his body tightened. Slowly, so slowly that Ethan wondered if he had imagined the first movement, Milo lifted his head. The yard, the fence, the wet air, every person watching seemed to fall away as he listened into the sound of another broken heart. Ruby pressed herself to the mesh, trembling. On the far side of the divide, Milo turned. Not all at once, not with the easy curiosity of the calf he had once been, but with the painful effort of something waking after too much darkness. By the time the second roll of thunder crossed the hills, he was facing her. And for the first time since Grace was taken away, Milo looked toward life instead of loss. The yard stayed still after Milo turned toward Ruby, as if even the rain had paused to see what he would do next. Water clung to the fence wire in trembling beads. Ruby stood pressed against the mesh, small body shaking, her trunk stretched through the gaps as far as it could reach. Milo did not move away. For the first time in weeks, he let another living need enter the space he had guarded with grief. No one called to him. No one dared break the moment with hope spoken too soon. Ethan stood just beyond, the service gate with Sarah and Naomi, all three of them quiet beneath the low mutter of thunder. Milo took one slow step, then another, until he was close enough to smell the storm on Ruby's skin, close enough to hear the sharp little breaths that came between her frightened cries. Ruby reached farther, searching blindly for comfort. Her trunk brushed the fence, slipped, then found the air again. Milo lifted his own trunk with a hesitation that made Sarah's chest ache. It hovered there for a beat, suspended between memory and instinct, and then lowered until the tip met Ruby's through the wire. The touch was light, almost uncertain, but Ruby stilled at once. It was not the excited contact of two playful calves meeting for the first time. It was quieter than that, deeper. Milo kept his trunk there as the rain darkened his back and the thunder moved farther across the hills. Ruby leaned into the fence and closed her eyes. Something passed between them that no human voice could have translated, yet everyone watching understood the shape of it. When Ruby let out another soft cry, Milo answered. The sound that left him was low and rough from disuse, more vibration than call, but it carried across the wet yard with a steadiness that changed the air around him. It was not the desperate cry of a baby looking for his mother. It was the beginning of another kind of voice, one meant to soothe, not summon. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands. Ethan felt Naomi touch his sleeve only once, a silent warning not to rush this into meaning too fast, but even she could not hide the shine in her eyes. Milo stood by the fence for a long time after that first answer, and each time Ruby shifted restlessly in fear, he made the same low sound again, as if learning it by using it. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the hills washed clean and bright. Ruby was the first to wake, already pacing the fence in quick, nervous loops until she saw Milo across the way. He was waiting for her, not at the wall, not in the corner where grief had pinned him for so many days. He stood in open ground, tired-eyed but present, watching her with quiet attention. The keepers kept the barrier in place for several more days, letting the two calves find each other in careful pieces. Ruby pushed a rubber ball through the lower gap, and Milo stared at it as though he had forgotten such things existed. Then, to Ben's astonishment, he nudged it back. The game lasted less than a minute, but afterward Ruby stayed near the fence as if she had been given a promise. Little by little, Milo's body remembered what his heart had nearly abandoned. He drank more steadily. He began finishing small meals instead of only touching them. Once, under Sarah's watchful eye, he walked to the mud patch and flung a clumsy spray over his shoulder, surprising himself so much that Ruby answered with a tiny chirp of delight from the other side of the mesh. Yet healing did not erase where he had been. Every evening, just before the last light slipped from the yard, Milo still made his way to Grace's photograph. He would stop there with the red strip of blanket tucked beneath his trunk and touch the frame with a tenderness so private the staff always turned away after a moment. Ruby, from her enclosure, learned to grow quiet when he did. A week later, Naomi agreed it was time for the next step. The inner gate between the two spaces was opened at dawn, while the grass still shone with dew. Ruby rushed through first, then slowed the instant she reached Milo, as if some ancient instinct told her that joy must approach grief gently. She circled him once, small and hopeful, and waited for him to decide what came next. Milo looked at her, then at the open yard beyond, then back toward the corner where he had once stood facing the wall. For a heartbeat, Ethan feared he would retreat there again. Instead, Milo lifted his trunk and rested it across Ruby's shoulders in the same protective way Grace had once done for him. Ruby leaned under it at once, and the whole rescue center seemed to exhale. From then on, they were rarely far apart. Milo showed Ruby where the sweetest pears landed when the keepers tossed them, where the pond stayed coolest in late afternoon, where the sun warmed the packed dirt after rain. Ruby gave him something different in return, not a replacement for what he had lost, but a reason to step forward carrying it. And in that exchange, his broken heart found a way to keep beating. If Milo's story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Just comment one if you believe animals feel grief and love just as deeply as we do. Or comment 0 if this story broke your heart today. Your comment may be simple, but it means a lot and helps this story reach more people who need to see it. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have more powerful, emotional animal stories coming next. Stories of loss, rescue, healing, and the quiet bonds that change lives forever.